Ah yes, Dialtown Phone Dating Simulator. A game where you can date phone people, printer people, even the Sasquatch himself. Boy, in a game as silly as this, I hope there's really no heartbreaking lore. If you've played Dialtown, you probably know about a guy named Callum Crown. If you think you know all the Dialtown lore from just the gameplay, you are sorely mistaken. There's a lot more to the iron-exerting man than meets the eye. Hell, there's a whole other guy that's so important he isn't even mentioned in Dialtown. Dogman is constantly updating his Tumblr page and giving us new Callum lore, so after only a couple of months this video will be outdated, but still, here is all the Callum Crown lore we know so far. Callum Crown was born in Dialtown on November 19th, 1923. He was born with deformities, meaning he only had one complete limb, his left arm, which limited his ability to do a lot of things. When America joined World War II, Callum signed up to fight, but wasn't accepted on account of his disability. Callum was forced to keep up with the war via radio. If only I could walk, Callum thought to himself. If I could walk, I could serve. Callum made use of his garage and built himself a pair of prosthetic legs out of any scrap metal he could find. He wrote to the army registration, telling them about his new metallic legs, but he never received a reply, so he kept sending letters, to no avail. Callum tried something new and bought his first telephone. He got through to the head enlister, who revealed that every one of Callum's letters had reached their office, but was simply thrown out en masse. "I am here to recruit the best of the best my country has to offer," stated the recruiter, "not some freak with metallic legs that'd slow the rest of my boys down." Callum was determined and took himself back to the garage. He built himself a right hand out of any scrap metal left from his legs. He connected the copper wire to his own nerves, making the very first working prosthetic hand. Nearing the end of World War II, Callum took his designs to the patent office, and in 1948, he started selling his prosthetic limbs to war veterans. This was successful at first, but once each soldier bought a leg or two, they didn't need to buy another. Callum knew his inventions had substantially improved his life, and he wanted to offer his fellow man an upgrade. He built a new prosthetic hand with built-in tools and showed it to the public in street shows, but he was laughed off as a self-mutilated idiot. Callum became a town oddity, a door-to-door salesman that was unwanted. He was lonely, watching the world move outside his garage. He never left his phone, not wanting to miss an opportunity for his dream to take off. His phone connected him to the outside world. That's when he got an idea. Callum spent a year working on his new design, a telephone that was built into your head. Despite them being clunky and unusual, the phones caught on quickly. The idea of having complete and portable phone access caught on. These object heads caused an economic boom. Young men and women getting hired left, right, and center as both manufacturers and operators in switchboard exchanges. This massive spike in employment made Callum extremely popular. He used his popularity to run for mayor. During his run for mayor, a journalist named Marla was an eager supporter of his. She gave him positive press attention, and this led to her having one-on-one interviews with him, during which the two developed feelings and at some point married. He won his mayoral campaign thanks to her positive press coverage. While he was mayor, he kept her around as an advisor and proto-campaign manager after noticing her oratory flair and appeal to a wide range of voters. Marla was intelligent, passionate, and very sharp, having a tendency to see through Callum's BS. His wife had a major influence on Callum's new design. He thought a typewriter would be a perfect companion for his phone head, due to her background in journalism. He basically treated himself and his wife as the object head Adam and Eve, and the trend stuck. The fact that Crown decided the model woman of the future would have a typewriter for her head conveys how highly he thought of her and how much he valued her abilities. Once he finished his term as mayor, Callum decided to run for state senator of Wisconsin. A man by the name of Milton Robert Wallace attended one of his rallies in Wisconsin. Milton was fiercely intelligent, an out-of-the-box thinker, but he was also known for his great sense of humor. Being quite witty, he was the only person that never failed to make Callum laugh and lose his composure. Milt grew up in a wealthier family than Callum, and was a corporal acting sergeant by the end of the war and had a distinguishing record as a war hero. He was well respected by those in his platoon, having a reputation for being honest, kind, and always going through on his word. He was also someone you didn't want to push around or back into a corner, due to his intelligence and his determination. Milton was a part of the D-Day landing, and he witnessed the Hiroshima bombing from a distance. Both of these events greatly impacted him. His time in the Pacific Theater wasn't as well known as his time in the European campaign, and he only ever opened up to Mahler about it. Milt went to college with a military scholarship, studying for a degree in genetics. The his personal focus was more on his relation to agriculture, as his theses revolved around using massive irrigation devices to transform large swathes of unused land in the Great Plains in order to yield food for humanity. Milton attended one of Callum's rallies in Wisconsin after Callum promised to eradicate poverty. Milton introduced himself sheepishly, mentioning his studies in combining organics and inorganics. Callum and Milton talked long after everyone had left the rally and long into the night. The two of them bounced off each other's ideas, sparking an immediate relationship. It's said that they had a mutual romantic relationship, but it's unknown to what extent. When Callum campaigned for president, he extended an arm to Milton, offering him the chance to be his vice president. Once he was in office, he quite literally extended an arm to Milt, gifting him the very first prosthetic hand he had built. It came with a note saying, "For my right-hand man." While Milton was in possession of this prosthetic, Callum used a much lighter hand he had built to be more efficient at things like typing. While Milton became VP, Marla became America's First Lady, though she struggled to settle into the role, as it had her doing next to nothing. Callum pulled some strings behind the curtains and managed to land her the role as press secretary, a role she was much more fit for due to her previously being a journalist. She constantly addressed the nation through radio and TV, though this did cause a strain in their relationship. Milton wrote, or at least co-wrote, most of Callum's most iconic speeches and was the one who found out that capitalizing on Callum's early life was a ticket to winning over the Americans. He wrote about the hurdles Callum had to jump to reach his success, which made him appear more, in my opinion, relatable and trustworthy. During Callum's presidency, he implemented many reforms, though it's questionable on how he got some of these passed. Some of these reforms being adding ranked choice voting and legalizing gay marriage. Callum was president during the Lavender Scare, a time in the mid-20th century where people were panicking about homosexual people working in the government, which led to many losing their jobs. And considering that both Milton and Callum were part of the LGBT community, this was a problem. J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI at the time, and he had a history for blackmailing presidents. Hoover had decisively called Milton a slur in private, and Callum saw that Hoover wasn't just an asshole, but he was also dangerous to let live. Callum talked to Milton about Hoover dying at his own hands in a short story that Dogman wrote. Actually, killing Hoover himself would have been really stupid, so Callum hired someone to put a bullet in Hoover's head. Milton knew in his heart and soul what Callum had done, but pretended to believe that Callum's assertion had nothing to do with it, knowing it was benefiting the country. With Hoover gone, the Lavender Scare was quick to cease. At Callum's closing speech at the end of his term in 1964, Callum was shot by a lone gunman who had come out of the crowd. This caused Callum to delay his speech slightly, making the assassin jump out at the wrong point in his speech. The assassination plan, which had been planned to the second, had gone out of sync. Callum had planned for the certain situations to ensure that he didn't die during his presidency, because as Dogman states, he 100% would have died early into his presidency. You can't just single-handedly decide to rewrite the plot without pissing a lot of people off. As Callum's term came to an end, he endorsed JFK for the 1964 election, not out of personal admiration but rather obligation. JFK got into office much later in Dialtown than in our universe, but Watergate happened much earlier, making the timeline normal again. After his presidency, Callum became the leader of the United Nations in 1965. This was definitely the most stressful time for Callum, having started doing cocaine in his time in the office, and his abuse of the substance became substantially more dire in the UN. Callum only trusted Milton with a lot of his ideas and important information, but there were still a lot of things he didn't tell him. Due to Callum's paranoia, he was terrified that Milt would reject him and walk away if he found out about some of the difficult decisions Callum had to make behind the scenes to ensure he reaches the goals that they had set out together. Callum was also extremely modified. While his metallic arms and legs were immediately visible, he also possessed internal mechanics, somehow reinforcing his vital organs. Due to his paranoia, all of his modifications were self-administered in surgical procedures he performed on himself while awake. At some point in Callum's time leading the UN, he and Marla had a son, Hannibal Crown, though Callum barely knew him. During the 50s and 60s, America was involved in the space race, and this is where we meet a man named Sergeant Norm Allen. Norm was born in the very onset of the Great Depression, and spent his adolescence working as a ranch hand to support his sick, polio-ridden mother after his father left. He struggled to support his mother, and began hating politics and big business. He fought in the Korean War as a bombardier pilot, sending money back to his mother, but shortly after his return, she passed away. Norm was offered an army scholarship and he took it, and he earned a PhD in theoretical astrophysics, though he kept that a secret due to his distaste for Ivy League academic environments. Norm attended a rally in Arizona during Callum's presidential campaign, recognizing him for his prosthetic company that made the braces that his mother used to walk. He grew a liking to Callum, recognizing that he was from a small town, as was he, and had a similar taste for elitist power structure. But due to his hard-headedness, he refused to admit that some of Callum's ideas made him uncomfortable. Norm was picked out by Callum for a mission to be the first person to enter a wormhole, which Norm agreed to. Callum held a ceremony for Norm in his honor, where he got to have a one-on-one conversation with Callum. In the summer of 1966, Norm was sent into a wormhole, leaving his family behind. Norm seemingly disappeared as he passed through the wormhole, although it was seamless for him, and after NASA was not able to get a hold of Norm, they pronounced him legally dead. This was not the case, however, but we'll circle back to that later. In 1966, Callum and Milton's relationship began to fall apart. Callum's idea of a worldwide dial-up, an idea of a mechanical world where everything and everyone had object heads, was greatly disapproved by Milton. He said in a conversation between the two, "I told you, gal, if you bring up that dial-up to me again, we're through. I can't live with that sort of," but he didn't get to finish as Callum cut him off. Callum didn't even tell Marla about his plans for the dial-up, as he feared that she'd think he'd lost it, though Dogman said that in his opinion, the assumption was incorrect. As their relationship drifted further and further apart, Callum and Milton had constant fights. They had a particularly big and heated argument in which Callum demanded Milton give back his prosthetic hand that he had gifted them when they were in office. Later that year, Milton took his own life, although we don't know how or when, and this made Callum feel terribly guilty. There's a Dialtown Easter egg that has a rare opportunity to show up when booting the game or during chapter selection. It says, "I love you, blank. For all eternity, I love you." The same words said by the former president James Polk just before he died. The only name that fits in the blank is the name Milt. Callum initiated the worldwide dial-up on December 31st, 1966, making it mandatory for people to get object heads. Everyone, animals too, were obligated to have an inorganic head. Every child was now born with adapters, and were given an object head right after being born. Meanwhile, animals were born with the object head already attached. And I feel really bad for cats who have to birth a whole litter of keyboards. Callum pitched his ideas of a better future, a functional, inclusive, mechanical world where all problems from famine to animal extinction to societal conflict and resource shortages all could be solved, preventing future wars and creating worldwide harmony. Due to his paranoia, he refused to write the plan down in its entirety or tell anyone what it was prior to the proposal's agreement. Needless to say, the vote in favor won by a landslide. On January 1st, 1967, it was time to announce his plans to the world. Just before his speech, he switched his lighter, newer prosthetic arm for his older one, the one he had gifted to Milt. When he stood on the podium, he gave his speech with his usual hand movements, though he accidentally wiped his answering box, which for his model telephone was being used to store his memories. All of them. His older prosthetic he wore was heavier than his newer one he was used to, and Callum was more twitchy from his cocaine addiction. But the main reason for accidentally wiping his memory was when you attach foreign extensions to appendages, you often overshoot. That prosthetic never felt like his again. In his heart, he still felt it was Milton, and the kilt forced him to slip up. The only one who he trusted with the recovery code to retrieve his memories was Milton, who was no longer alive. Milton wound up with the custody of Callum's husk right after he lost his memory. Doctors tried to fix him, but Callum never wrote down the schematics for his version of his head, making fixing it a complete mystery. They decided to let him live the rest of his life like this, having no idea he was going to live another half a century thanks to his modifications. By then, Callum was merely a shell of the man he was, and Marla had grown sick of him. She moved back to Dialtown, most likely admitting him to the nursing home he still resides in to this day. Callum now sits in a nursing home, tweaking his old radio, asking anyone who comes by him,
"Is the war over yet? I can't get a signal."
Callum's son, Hannibal, grew up and had his daughter Michelle Crown, aka Mingus. Hannibal was an underwhelming tiger parent, often comparing her achievements to Callum's at a young age, despite barely knowing his father, since Callum lost his memory when Hannibal was only a toddler. After years of neglect, she didn't want her father's love, rather her senile grandfather's, and she idolized Callum to an unhealthy degree, wanting to make him proud. And when she grew older, she rigged Dialtown's elections to become the mayor and tried to recreate Dialtown as it was when Callum was in charge. She constantly checked up on him in the nursing home where he lived, and she used the town's funds to have a cosmetic surgery to make herself look like Callum's old cat, and called herself Mingus, after said cat in its desperate attempt to have him regain his memory. In the early 2020s, Norm landed back on Earth. Coming out of the wormhole, Norm had travelled instantly from 1966 to the 2020s. Presumably, after finding out that his family had long passed, he travelled to Dialtown to find Callum. Due to missing the dial-up, Norm was the only person left on Earth without an inorganic head. Mingus was not happy to find out about him being in town, seeing his organic head as a blemish in her vision of a perfect Dialtown. She painted Norm as a dangerous monster and a threat to normality itself, and quickly got him exiled. Norm retreated to a shack on the outskirts of town, where he'd stay for a few years, sulking in his own misery and planning Mingus's death to be a murder-suicide. After Norm was gone, she continued to try and make a perfect Dialtown, and to bring back Callum's memory. She took him to places he recognized, people he used to know, and took him to the best doctors in the country. Hell, she even asked the hobo if he could fix him, but to no avail. In Chapter 3, Mingus mentioned how her grandfather wouldn't even look at her, instead looking at Gingy, who was eating trash outside his window. The only time he did look at her, in a rare moment of lucidity, he mistook her for his late wife Marla. He asked her if she'd do it all over with him, if given the chance. Mingus didn't want to tell him that Marla had since died, and for him to experience that heartbreak again, only for him to forget it minutes later. Mingus said, "I answered if I was her, responding just as I hoped she would. Yes, my songbird, I would." He stared off, now content. His gaze slowly drifted towards the floor, and he didn't say another word. All these events lead up to the time when Dialtown takes place. You can meet people who give their own opinions on the metal-wielding American visionary. President Crown built both of his legs, one of his arms, and achieved all but one of his dreams. And he is the only sentient human being alive that cannot comprehend this. If you possess more knowledge than me on the topic of Dialtown, and you know I missed anything, please be so kind as to tell me what I left out, or not. Now I shall depart, until we meet again.